Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The heavy silence in the room was only broken by the hum of the ceiling fan as it sliced through thick, humid air. Matthew sat in the center of his living room, legs crossed, eyes fixed on the muted television screen where a paused image of a wedding played, his first wedding. Miriam's smile beamed from the screen, caught mid-laugh as if mocking the gloom that had swallowed the house. The same room once danced with laughter, choked with the aroma of fried plantain and scented candles, the walls bearing witness to whispered dreams and spontaneous dances in oversized pajamas. Now, it echoed only with regret. His caftan, once crisp and radiant, hung loosely on his frame. The man who once strolled through Acacia's streets with pride now sat hunched, shoulders heavy with choices that once seemed glorious. He reached for the glass of untouched juice on the stool beside him, but stopped midway, letting his hand hang midair. There were moments, too many, when the past collided with the present and refused to be silenced. He thought about how easy it was to desire more without asking what it might cost. Every decision felt sharp now, jagged like broken glass, cutting quietly through his peace. He hadn't always been like this. Matthew had been a man of ambition, raised in a two-bedroom bungalow in Suralire with dreams larger than the clouds that hovered over Lagos Island. A first-class graduate, a real estate consultant with charm that opened doors and closed deals. He had met Miriam when life still had simplicity tucked in its pocket. She was soft-spoken, strong-willed, and smelled like fresh bread and cocoa butter. Their early years were far from perfect, but they were rich in their own way. Walking in the rain without umbrellas, splitting one roasted corn by Third Mainland Bridge, whispering names for unborn children at midnight. That love, though battered, had once been his anchor. But as his pockets thickened and his circle expanded, so did the voices. Friends at bar lounges in Lekki Phase one whispered praises into his ears, hyping him as a man too powerful for monogamy. A lion doesn't hunt with one paw, one of them had laughed. The phrase became his anthem. When Janet came into his life, with her glossy lips and mind sharp like a tailor's needle, it felt like a reward for hard work, an extension of success, not a betrayal. He didn't see the shift, the cracks in Miriam's eyes, or the cold silence that began to fill their bedroom like fog. Janet had been nothing like Miriam. She was fierce, ambitious, and magnetic, the kind of woman who turned heads just by entering a room. She walked into his seminar in Lekki with confidence stitched into her every step. Her questions were bold, her laughter unapologetic, and before long, she became a part of his narrative. Miriam's quiet eyes saw what Matthew's pride didn't, that she was slowly being replaced. But she never screamed or begged. She simply stepped back, her silence screaming louder than any protest. When Matthew married Janet, he justified it with twisted logic. He claimed it was cultural, that his lineage accepted polygamy, that he was building an empire. But the empire had too many doors and not enough walls. Aisha was the unexpected addition. She came through a favor gone long. A cousin's friend who needed a place to stay during NYSC. She was young, respectful, always cooking, always thanking him. He never meant to fall for her. Or maybe he did. Maybe he had become addicted to being worshipped. By the time he realized it, it was too late. 3 women under one roof, held together by threads thinner than cobwebs. Evenings in the house became battlegrounds wrapped in silence. Miriam withdrew to prayer meetings and long walks. Janet filled the living room with music and perfume, her voice sharp as a knife edge when she spoke. Aisha remained quiet, too quiet, moving like a shadow between rooms, often retreating to her corner like an intruder in her own home. And Matthew, he tried to be the sun to 3 moons, burning himself in the process. He bought gifts when apologies couldn't be formed, scheduled time like a manager juggling projects. Monday evenings were for Miriam, Fridays for Janet, Sundays for Aisha, each slot planned like a meeting, each conversation layered with caution. But homes are not built on rosters. You can't schedule peace or timetable affection. One evening, as he returned from a business dinner with Janet, the silence in the compound was loud. Too loud. Even the generator's hum seemed to pause in anticipation. Inside, Miriam sat with a packed bag, not crying, not angry, just tired. "You don't even notice when I stop breathing," she said, rising slowly. He reached out instinctively, but his fingers curled into his palm midway. That was the night the house stopped being a home. The early signs came not like lightning but like fog, quiet, creeping, and easily mistaken for morning dew. It began with missed greetings, sideways glances, and awkward silences in the kitchen whenever two wives crossed paths. Janet, always sharp-tongued, started leaving indirect comments around the house, statements like "some women forget this is not their father's house," or "if you don't have class, stay where you belong." She never called names, but her words were sharpened blades wrapped in satin. Miriam, seasoned in quiet endurance, ignored it at first, thinking silence would douse the fire. But silence doesn't starve resentment, it feeds it in darkness. Aisha, the youngest and most timid of the three, tried to play peacemaker. She'd compliment Miriam's cooking, laugh at Janet's jokes, pretend she didn't notice the tension. But even good intentions can become casualties in a war of proximity. One evening, when all three women were present during a family dinner, Aisha mistakenly sat in Matthew's usual seat. Janet hissed and barked. "So now, Corper, you no even sabi where to sit. I'll be you one turn madam of the house." Aisha stood frozen, eyes wide, unsure whether to speak or shrink. Miriam, without looking up, calmly said, "She's pregnant, and you're older. Show some grace." The table fell silent. That night, Matthew received 3 different messages from his wives. One crying, one ranting, one asking to sleep over at her sister's place. He read them all, sighed deeply, and turned off his phone. The house had grown too loud, even when no one was speaking. Matthew began to operate like a man managing a stock portfolio, allocating time, affection, and money across 3 women who now resided not in his heart, but in his calendar. Mondays and Thursdays were for Miriam. She handled the kids, the home, and still managed his tax papers. Wednesdays and Saturdays were for Janet. She craved attention and often demanded outings, whether to a restaurant in Victoria Island or a hotel bar in Acadia where they could be seen. Tuesdays and Sundays belonged to Aisha, whose softness had started hardening beneath the weight of her new life. Fridays, Matthew reserved for himself. He would lock his study, pour 2 fingers of Hennessy into a glass, and listen to Fela or Sod on his Bluetooth speaker. But no matter how smooth the liquor or how sweet the saxophone, nothing drowned the mental noise that had become his daily soundtrack. On those nights, he would scroll through his own life like it was someone else's Instagram feed, admiring his tailored outfits, the polished smiles, the illusion of control. But illusions crack, and in Matthew's case, it began subtly, like forgetting to sign a check for Miriam's driver, or missing Aisha's antenatal appointment, or leaving Janet's birthday gift on the back seat of his car for 2 days. Each mistake, no matter how small, was recorded by the women like offenses in a courtroom. And every error added another block to the growing wall between him and each of them. But Matthew didn't see the structure he was building, not yet. He still believed he was the architect of a new kind of family model. In his mind, he was managing diversity. In reality, he was juggling fireballs with one hand tied. Things reached a boiling point the evening Miriam's son, David, aged 9, returned from school with a bruised lip and swollen knuckles. He had gotten into a fight with Janet's daughter, Ada, who was only 7. When asked what happened, David muttered, "She said my mummy is number 1, but the others are prettier." Miriam's heart clenched. Not because of the fight, but because those words could have only come from overhearing adults. Children don't invent such comparisons on their own. She kept quiet, but her silence was charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Matthew, when told, tried to wave it off, saying, "Children will be children." But this wasn't about children anymore. This was a powder keg, and Matthew had begun lighting matches near it without realizing. Meanwhile, Janet confronted Miriam in the driveway later that evening. "Tell your son to keep his dirty hands to himself. Oh, if he touch Ada again, he go red for here." Miriam stared at her without blinking, replying, "Maybe if you raised her better, she'd know how to shut her mouth." That was the first time anyone in the compound heard the 2 women scream at each other, real, unfiltered rage. Neighbors turned off their generators to listen. By the time Matthew arrived home, the security guard was standing awkwardly between both women, sweat drenching his uniform, unsure whose orders to follow. The compound that once echoed with quiet wealth now trembled with voices too bitter to be ignored. Inside, Aisha locked herself in the guest room, pressing her belly gently, whispering prayers. She had no fight left in her. She was simply trying to survive her own quiet war. It was during a dinner with a business associate at a rooftop lounge in Ikoyi that the reality started to dawn on Matthew, not in a dramatic epiphany, but in a slow, painful realization that pricked his confidence like a slow leak in a tire. The associate, a man named Obinna, older and notoriously blunt, asked after Miriam. Matthew smiled and replied, "She's doing well." Then Obinna smirked and added, "And the others? Now offer you oh. You know they fear women walla." The joke hit Matthew harder than expected. Not because of the words, but because they mirrored what he had been silently asking himself. As he sipped his drink and looked at the glittering Lagos skyline, he felt a hollowness that didn't used to be there. It wasn't about the money, his businesses were still running. It wasn't about the status, he still walked into rooms like he owned the air. It was something else. A tension that lived in his neck, a weight that settled in his chest when he entered his compound. The wives weren't just wives anymore. They were storms, each pulling in different directions, and Matthew, once so sure of his navigation, was losing his compass. That night, as he drove home through the third mainland bridge, he kept the windows down. The city's wind felt colder than usual. He reached his gate, parked without honking, and sat in the car for 10 full minutes, staring at the blue-lit compound that had become his battlefield. He knew something had shifted, something important, but he still didn't know whether it was in his home, his heart, or his fate. All he knew was, peace no longer lived where he slept. The days began to bleed into one another in a rhythm that felt both familiar and foreign to Matthew. On the surface, everything looked intact. The businesses still opened, the tenants still paid rent, and his name was still printed in bold on office stationery. But the true chaos lived behind the walls of his compound. It became a place where people only spoke to prove a point or win an argument, not to connect or understand. Even the house staff had begun walking on eggshells. The steward, Cunnell, now triple-checked every instruction before acting on it, because he never knew which wife would contradict the other. The cook, Mama Saad, kept her earphones in permanently now, blasting gospel music while she chopped peppers and cleaned fish, just to drown out the bitterness that hung in the air like stale perfume. Aisha, whose pregnancy had reached its second trimester, stopped stepping out of her room entirely except when Matthew asked for her. She moved slowly, like someone whose body carried more than just a child. It carried fear, loneliness, and something else unspoken. She didn't ask for much. She never had. But now, even her silence felt heavy. On one particular morning, while Matthew was tying his tie in front of the mirror, she knocked gently and entered without waiting for a response. Her eyes were puffy, voice fragile. "The baby's not moving like before," she said. He looked at her, unsure if she expected comfort or action. He nodded slowly and replied, "Let's go to the hospital later in the evening. I have a meeting this morning." She stood there for a moment longer, searching his face for something, maybe affection, maybe sincerity, but she didn't find it. She simply turned and walked out, her slippers making no sound on the tiled floor. In that moment, Matthew realized that the distance wasn't just emotional anymore. It had become physical, spiritual, and irreversible. Janet, on the other hand, refused to let her presence go unnoticed. She was fire, unrelenting, bright, and dangerous when ignored. The more she sensed the emotional gap between herself and Matthew widening, the louder she became. She no longer pretended to be diplomatic or respectful to the other women. If anything, she weaponized her position. "I'm the one he takes out," she once said loudly while on the phone with her sister, knowing Aisha was within earshot. "The rest of them are just old furniture collecting dust." These kinds of comments, once sprinkled occasionally, became her daily vocabulary. She would wear high heels to the living room just to make her entrance heard, switch on the TV loudly at odd hours, or leave makeup items in the shared spaces as territorial markers. She accused Miriam's son of stealing her car key one evening, insisting that the boy had bad behavior like his mother. Miriam, who had long tried to hold herself back, stood and faced her in full view of the household staff. "If I start to talk today, Janet, you'll sleep outside," she said with a calmness that carried more threat than any shout could. Janet laughed sarcastically. "Talk now. Talk! Let's see who they'll believe. The silent shadow or the woman with his heart?" Matthew, hearing the commotion from his study, didn't come out. He stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop, frozen mid-sentence. It had become a pattern. Every confrontation left him more withdrawn, more numb. He no longer had the strength to play mediator. He told himself that adults would sort themselves out, but deep down, he knew he had lost control. His family was no longer a home. It was a theater of grievances, where every day was another act, and peace was not even a distant dream. It was an extinct language. The breaking point didn't arrive like thunder. It came on a Wednesday morning with a phone call that changed the atmosphere of the house permanently. Aisha had collapsed while walking to the gate to collect a delivery. The gate man found her curled on the pavement, unconscious, palms clutching her stomach. She was rushed to the hospital in a neighbor's car, because Matthew was unreachable, stuck in a meeting at a hotel conference room in Acadia, his phone buried under paperwork. By the time he arrived at the hospital, sweat-soaked and panting, the doctor had finished his sentence. "We lost the baby. She's stable, but emotionally fragile. Please keep the house quiet for her." Matthew couldn't speak. He walked into the ward and saw Aisha lying there, eyes closed, fur attached to her hand, cheeks pale like someone who hadn't seen sunlight in days. For a moment, he just stood there, watching the rise and fall of her chest. He wanted to say sorry, but it felt too small. He wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Back at the house, Janet made a passive remark while applying her makeup. She never looked strong enough for that pregnancy anyway. Miriam, who had returned briefly to pick up some of her son's books, stopped and faced her. "God sees everything," she said quietly. "Even the things we say when we think no one's listening." That night, the house didn't just feel silent, it felt haunted. Matthew sat in the living room long after the generator went off, staring into the dark, the echo of the doctor's words playing on loop in his mind. He realized that for the first time in years, he didn't know how to fix what had been broken. And maybe he never really had the tools in the first place. After the loss, everything changed, but not in the way healing stories go. There was no group hug, no lessons learned over dinner, just a deeper, heavier silence. Aisha moved out a week later. Her brother came down from Zaria, packed her things, and said only one thing to Matthew. "You brought her joy, then sorrow. Let her rest somewhere else." She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look back. Miriam sent a message 2 days later that she would not be returning. Not for any discussion, not for the children's sake, not even for closure. She had found a new apartment in Agba, and was focusing on her tailoring business again. Janet stayed, but her energy changed. She was less aggressive, not from growth, but from boredom. Her victories now felt like shouting into an empty room. Matthew, once the man who couldn't be ignored, now spent his evenings in the backyard, sitting under the old pawpaw tree, sipping beer from a plastic cup, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. Peace requires harmony. This was more like an emotional graveyard where old arguments and broken dreams were buried without ceremony. Every room held a ghost. Every silence screamed. He thought often of what it had cost him, not in naira, not in assets, but in things too fragile to measure: trust, intimacy, laughter. He scrolled through old photos on his phone one evening, and paused at one from years ago, Miriam smiling in their first rented apartment, holding their first baby. He stared at the photo, then at the empty seat across from him. A fan buzzed overhead, pushing hot air around a cold house. And for the first time, not as a husband or father or provider, but just as a man, Matthew whispered into the quiet, "I don't know who I am anymore." Matthew woke up before the alarm most mornings now, not because he had somewhere to be, but because sleep had become a difficult guest, visiting in patches and leaving before dawn. The walls of the house no longer carried the soft sounds of life. No clatter from the kitchen, no children running down the corridor, no voices arguing from behind bedroom doors. It was as if silence had claimed tenancy, and even the breeze moving through the open windows felt cautious, like it didn't want to disturb what had settled. He sometimes walked barefoot from room to room, looking at untouched couches, picture frames now coated with a thin film of dust, curtains pulled back halfway. He'd pause in front of Aisha's old room, and gently tap the doorknob with his fingers, not entering, just standing there. The memory of her last morning in that house, her pale face, her fragile steps, her refusal to say goodbye, those things lingered heavier than any words. Miriam's old wardrobe still had one of her wrappers folded neatly on the bottom shelf. He hadn't touched it, not because he was holding on, but because removing it felt like confirming something final. Janet, who had once filled the house with loud heels and louder laughter, now moved like a shadow, there but distant. She had become indifferent, neither confrontational nor comforting. Their conversations, when they happened, were short and functional. "You ate? Money for the fuel?" "The plumber came." That was it. Nothing more. Nothing less. Matthew often wondered how something that had started with passion, fire, and declarations of forever could flatten into this quiet cohabitation. It wasn't hatred. Hatred still meant you cared enough to feel. This was something worse, emptiness wearing the skin of routine. Business had begun to slide, not with a crash, but with a steady decline so subtle it almost went unnoticed. Payments came in later than expected. A few longtime clients began to shift their loyalty to newer, hungrier competitors. Staff meetings became a burden for Matthew. He would sit at the head of the conference table, nodding absently while his managers presented slides and numbers. The spark that once fueled his ideas was gone. There were moments he would forget the name of a client he had worked with for years, or stare at a contract for 20 minutes before realizing he hadn't read a word. His assistant, Chuka, tried to pick up the slack, gently reminding him of appointments, whispering names before meetings, even handling calls Matthew didn't have the energy to answer. But the business world is not sentimental. It rewards consistency and punishes distraction. Rumors began to circulate in the Lagos network that Matthew Uche had lost his edge, that he was no longer the shrewd strategist who once closed deals at wine bars before the bill even came. Some assumed it was financial exhaustion. Others whispered about possible depression. A few thought he had become a woman person, the kind of man whose domestic drama had spilled into his professional life. Matthew, unaware of most of the talk, simply moved slower, reacted less. He began canceling public appearances, skipping social events, turning down partnerships he would have once jumped at. It wasn't that he didn't care anymore. It was that caring now required energy, and he was rationing what little remained. One afternoon, he stood in his office, looking out at the traffic crawling along the streets below. His reflection in the glass startled him, not because of how different he looked, but because of how unfamiliar he felt. The man in the mirror had weary eyes and a jaw clenched not in determination but fatigue. That was when it truly hit him. He hadn't just lost people. He had lost himself. What remained of his social life had shrunk to routine visits from a few friends who still remembered who he used to be. Once a month, Whale would drop by with a bottle of whiskey and news from the outside world. They'd sit on the balcony, sipping in silence before Whale would say something like, "Bro, you for just marry one woman and rest. Now you complicate your own peace." Matthew never responded to those jabs. Not because he disagreed, but because every word echoed thoughts he had been choking on for months. Another friend, Taupe, came with a different angle. "I warned you. Go here. Now this Lagos day deceive men. 3 women, even Solomon for Bible not king." Matthew would chuckle faintly, not from amusement, but from the irony of it all. How people who once envied him now used his life as a cautionary tale. One evening, during one of those visits, Whale leaned forward and said something that lingered for days after. "Even look like person way day live again. You just day exist. Now survival mode you enter." That line stayed with him. Not because it was poetic, but because it was true. He wasn't building anymore. He wasn't pursuing or dreaming. He was simply moving from one moment to the next, surviving the hours as they passed. Even his laughter had become reflexive, like a muscle memory without emotion. And the house, once a symbol of success, had become a cage lined with memories. Every corner reminded him of what had been. The hallway reminded him of Aisha's soft footsteps. The dining room echoed with Janet's old jokes. The backyard still carried traces of Miriam's voice scolding the kids. Matthew wasn't surrounded by people anymore. He was surrounded by ghosts with familiar faces. It was a Sunday evening when the final fracture came, not with shouting, but with a document. Janet placed it gently on the dining table, beside his untouched plate of rice. Her voice was even almost too calm. "I want out," she said, then turned and walked away. Matthew stared at the neatly arranged legal papers, each page heavy with implications. He didn't move for minutes. It wasn't the divorce itself that shook him. It was the absence of emotion in her delivery. "No srets. No ters. Just conclusion." He thought about stopping her, asking her why, begging her to reconsider. But a voice inside him whispered, "Let her go." Because holding on had only bred more damage. He signed the documents the next morning without reading them properly, handed them back to her, and watched her walk out of the compound with the same red luggage she had carried in years ago. There were no neighbors watching. No ters. No final words. Just the sound of a gate opening and closing. That night, Matthew wandered around the house like someone trying to find a misplaced item. But what he was looking for wasn't physical. He was searching for the man he had been before ego took the wheel. Before ambition blurred his vision. Before love became a battlefield. He ended up in the boys' quarters, sitting on an old bench with a cracked edge, sipping Gary like it was aged wine. The same man who once booked tables at Sky Lounge without calling ahead now sat among broken buckets and rusted fans. A cat meowed from a corner. The air was humid, the silence louder than ever. And somewhere between the sour taste of Gary and the ache in his back, he accepted the truth he had dodged for too long. All the things he had chased, status, dominance, applause, had cost him what mattered most. Not one grand mistake, but 1,000 little choices that chipped away at everything good. And now, with no wife, no laughter, no light in the rooms, Matthew realized he was not the king he imagined. He was the ruin of his own kingdom. The days passed without names now. There was no difference between a Monday or a Saturday. Each one arrived like an uninvited guest, sat heavily in the room, and left without a word. The routine was mechanical. Wake up before the sun, splash cold water on his face, stare at the mirror without seeing anything, and move from one empty room to another. Matthew no longer lived with purpose. He only moved to avoid stagnation. The compound was quieter than ever. The birds that once nested in the mango tree had long disappeared, chased away by the loud voices that had once turned the house into a war zone. Now, even nature had abandoned the place. Occasionally, the security guard would knock gently and say, "Oga, dem drop letter for gate," and Matthew would nod without standing up. The letters were often bills, waste management, electricity disconnection notices, sometimes bank correspondence he barely understood anymore. His eyes would drift across the pages, but never settle. He kept the envelopes in a drawer that had become a graveyard of unopened responsibility. There were mornings he thought about calling one of the wives, not out of desire, but simply to hear a voice that once belonged to something real. But shame wrapped its fingers around his throat before he could pick the phone. He told himself he was giving them space, but deep down, he knew they had already given up trying to reach him. It wasn't that they hated him. Hatred still requires some level of emotional investment. What they felt now was absence. Not the kind that waits by the window, but the kind that quietly builds a new life elsewhere and stops looking back. Business followed the same trajectory, slow disintegration beneath the weight of neglect. The few loyal staff members who stayed did so more out of habit than hope. Files gathered dust on shelves that once held quarterly reports, signed contracts, and revenue targets. His company accountant, Udo, called one afternoon with a concerned tone, explaining that the bank had issued a warning. If a particular debt wasn't serviced within the next 2 weeks, foreclosure proceedings might begin. Matthew sat silently as Udo spoke, nodding slowly even though Udo couldn't see him. After the call ended, he didn't feel panic. He didn't even feel disappointment. What he felt was numbness, a stillness that had replaced ambition. Once, he used to map out plans for expansion. He had vision boards, strategy meetings, consultants flying in from Port Harcourt and Abuja. Now all that felt like a different lifetime. Even when he drove past the buildings he owned, he no longer looked at them with pride. They felt foreign, like a suit that no longer fit. He started selling off little things quietly, his second car, a plot of land he had bought years ago near Aja, a few shares in a transport startup he once backed. He didn't tell anyone. He simply sent instructions via email, signed forms, and watched the numbers shift in his bank account. These weren't solutions. They were stall tactics, like plugging holes in a sinking ship while pretending you could still reach shore. His driver, Musa, left without a word one Thursday morning. Just dropped the keys on the dining table and walked out. That evening, Matthew drove himself through the city for the first time in months, the roads looking unfamiliar despite their familiarity. He paused at every traffic light longer than necessary, sometimes long after it turned green, until angry honks reminded him to move. He didn't care. Lagos had moved on. And so had everyone else. The house began to decay, subtly at first, then rapidly. The plumbing failed in the kitchen. Water trickled from the taps like it had somewhere more important to be. One of the walls in the upstairs corridor developed a crack that widened week by week. The compound weeds grew taller than the flowers Miriam once planted by the entrance. The lights flickered when they came on at all. Matthew stopped noticing. He'd sit outside at dusk with a half cup of tea, watching the street stretch into shadows, mosquitoes buzzing near his ears, but he didn't swat them. He barely blinked. A neighbor, Madame Ojeki, passed by one evening and greeted him with a mixture of pity and awkward politeness. "Good evening, sir. You day try. God go see you through." He nodded but said nothing. After she walked away, he smiled faintly. It was the first smile in days, but it didn't reach his eyes. He thought about how different things had been not long ago. 3 wives, multiple cars, noise, motion, pride so thick it blocked reason. Back then, he would have never sat alone under the stars sipping cold tea in silence. He would have been at a dinner meeting or on the phone negotiating a deal. Now he watched ants crawl over his bare foot and didn't move. The house had turned into a museum of mistakes, each corner holding memories like dusty photographs. His bedroom was no longer a place of rest. It was a hall of echoes, every night dragging in old voices, old laughter, old versions of himself. He no longer feared loneliness. He had made peace with it. What he feared now was permanence, that this state of emptiness was not a season, but the new reality he would carry to his final days. There were nights he dreamt of the past, but the memories came back twisted, like scenes from an old film projected on a wall full of cracks. Sometimes he'd see Miriam laughing in their old apartment, wearing the same wrapper she used to wear on Sunday mornings while frying akra. But the laughter would fade too fast. Other times, he saw Janet in her red dress, the one she wore to his 40th birthday, but her face would blur halfway through the dream, replaced by something unfamiliar. Aisha rarely appeared. When she did, it was always at a distance, walking away from him in slow motion, holding a child he never got to meet. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, confused, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't explain. He'd sit on the edge of the bed, hands on his face, as the fan creaked overhead and the room stared back at him with blankness. He once tried writing, opened a notebook and started jotting down random thoughts, trying to find himself in the process. But the words felt foreign. They didn't match the man who once stood in boardrooms with confidence, who once managed the egos of 3 women with arrogance disguised as charm. He thought about calling his children. He missed them more than he admitted. He missed the sound of their feet on the stairs, their innocent questions, their sleepy hugs. But the shame weighed heavier than the longing. He hadn't been there. Not really. He had been a presence, not a father. That kind of absence couldn't be fixed with a phone call. So he tore out the page he wrote on and threw it into the bin. Then he lit a candle for no reason, just to see a different kind of light. And in that dim flicker, surrounded by dust, silence, and the quiet hum of regret, he whispered something he hadn't said in a long time. God, I'm tired. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just a man speaking into the air, unsure if anyone, or anything, was listening. Matthew no longer kept track of time in the way he once did. The wall clock in the living room had stopped ticking weeks ago, its battery drained, the hour hand stuck between 2 and 3, as though unsure of what came next. He hadn't bothered to fix it. In fact, he barely noticed until one of the neighborhood boys who came to sweep the compound pointed it out. "Oga, timed on pause for hero," the boy joked, laughing as he dragged a broom across the dusty tiles. Matthew didn't respond. He sat in the cane chair under the veranda, staring out at the rusted gate. He had developed a habit of sitting there from morning till sunset, watching people pass, watching Kiki riders swerve, watching hawkers shout prices for groundnut and gala, watching the world forget him. He didn't resent them. If anything, he envied their momentum. Everyone seemed to be going somewhere, doing something. He, on the other hand, had mastered stillness. It wasn't peace. It was just the absence of chaos. The compound had become his last territory. The mango tree no longer bore fruit. The tap in the backyard had stopped flowing completely. He fetched water now in kegs, a task that once belonged to the My Guard. At first, it embarrassed him. Then it became normal. Then it became necessary. He didn't mind the blisters on his palms anymore. He didn't mind the ants in the kitchen or the leak in the ceiling above the corridor. He told himself, this is what remains. This is what I deserve. It was a kind of punishment he didn't try to escape, not because he loved suffering, but because deep inside him, he believed it was the closest thing to atonement he could afford. When the letter from the school came, it arrived sealed in a plain brown envelope, hand-delivered by a courier who wore a polite expression and avoided eye contact. Matthew opened it slowly at the dining table, careful not to tear the paper inside. It was an invitation to David's graduation ceremony. The son he hadn't spoken to in over a year. The letter wasn't from Miriam. It was signed by the school principal, a woman who had known the family before it crumbled. There was no personal message, no plea for reconciliation. Just the details, time, date, venue. Matthew read it 3 times. Not because the information was unclear, but because he needed to confirm that someone somewhere still remembered him enough to send an envelope. He thought about whether he should go. He hadn't seen David since he last visited the house to pick up old books. The boy had grown. The photographs he occasionally saw online showed a face that was harder now, more defined, more guarded. A face Matthew no longer recognized. That night, he walked slowly around the house, picking up an old shirt David had once worn, a crumpled drawing that had been under a couch, a broken toy car still sitting in the storeroom. He placed them on the table one after the other, not as decoration but as reminders. Of what was. Of what could have been. When morning came, he ironed his clothes, shaved his face carefully, sprayed the last of a cologne he hadn't touched in months, and called for a Bolt ride. The car that arrived was small, the air conditioning barely working, but Matthew didn't mind. He sat in the back quietly, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. He didn't know what he was expecting at the school. Forgiveness? Acknowledgement? Closure? Maybe none. Maybe he just wanted to see his son walk across a stage and feel, even briefly, like he had contributed to something that didn't collapse. The school compound buzzed with the kind of joy Matthew hadn't felt in a long time. Children ran around in graduation gowns, proud parents posed for pictures, teachers called out names with wide smiles. Matthew stood near the gate, his presence awkward, unsure of where to go or who to ask for. He saw Miriam first, standing with David under a palm tree, adjusting his cap and wiping something off his shirt. She looked the same, yet different. Not older. Just more composed, more complete. She hadn't seen him yet. David glanced in his direction once, then looked away. That single glance carried more weight than any speech. It said everything. The years of distance. The choices made. The absence. Matthew didn't move. He couldn't. His legs suddenly felt heavier than his whole body. Miriam eventually saw him. Their eyes met across the crowd. There was no smile, no frown, just a long, still stare. A greeting passed between them silently, made only of breath and memory. She didn't call him over. He didn't approach. He stood there, watching from a distance, like someone who had wandered into a place he no longer belonged. When David's name was called, and he walked onto the stage, Matthew clapped. Not loudly, just enough for his own hands to feel it. And when the boy collected his certificate, flashing a smile at the crowd, Matthew felt a strange warmth fill his chest. It wasn't pride. It wasn't regret. It was something in between. Something soft, unfamiliar, and temporary. When the event ended, he didn't wait to greet anyone. He turned around, walked out the gate, and kept walking until the Bolt driver called him back. He entered the car wordlessly, windows rolled down, letting the city's wind slap against his face, as if to remind him that life was still happening outside his silence. The final days became quieter, but not in the way Matthew had imagined. The house no longer felt like a punishment. It didn't feel like anything. It simply existed, and so did he. He began to write again, not with ambition, but with honesty. Short notes. Phrases. Observations. Notebooks filled with incomplete thoughts, half-sentences, reflections that drifted between guilt and acceptance. He no longer waited for calls. He no longer expected reconciliation. But there were small joys. A neighbor bringing him jollof rice on Sunday. A stray cat he began feeding in the evenings. A phone call from an old schoolmate who hadn't heard of his downfall and simply wanted to catch up. He'd sit outside at dusk with the cat curled by his feet, his eyes closed, listening to the sounds of Lagos, the sirens, the laughter, the horns. He didn't smile much, but he no longer cried either. He had moved past both extremes into something flat but bearable. One evening, as he lay on the bed with a soft rain tapping the windows, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Maybe this is what's left of me." There was no reply. Just the wind outside, moving through the cracks in the wall. The light bulb flickered once, then steadied. And somewhere in the distance, far from his compound, far from his reach, the world carried on. People fell in love. Children were born. Friends shared jokes. New lives were being built with the same tools he had once misused. But Matthew was still. Not redeemed. Not condemned. Just present. A man who had once built an empire of women and walls, now reduced to echoes and small moments. And in that quiet place, beneath the hum of regret and the weight of memory, he found something he hadn't looked for in years. Not peace, not purpose, but the courage to simply keep breathing. My people, let this story speak louder than just words. Sometimes, what we call enjoyment is quietly digging the ground beneath our own feet. Not every opportunity is a blessing, and not every desire is worth the destruction it may cause. Learn to protect your peace like it's gold, because once peace goes missing, even the most beautiful house will start to feel like a prison. May we never trade loyalty for lust. May we never choose ego over empathy. And may we never realize too late that the family we abandoned was the very thing that made us whole. Father, we thank you for the gift of wisdom. May we never walk into battles dressed in pride. May our homes be filled with understanding, not competition. May we choose love over chaos, patience over pressure, and peace over pride. Let the lessons of others become the caution in our own journey. May we never build what will later break us. And may the ones we love never become strangers because of our foolishness. Give us eyes to see value where the world sees simplicity. Give us strength to say no when our hearts are chasing yes. And when life tests us, Lord, give us grace not to fail. Let our story not end in regret. Let our legacy be joy. And when the time comes to reflect, may our hearts be full, not empty. If you believe this, say aloud, peaceful. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.